Hi, Misha here, and kind of ongoing look at British fighter bombers, interceptors from the Second World War period. We have Hawker's Hurricane and Hawker's Typhoon. We've looked at several others already, including the Hawker Fury. We've looked at the Hawker Heart. We've looked at the Bolton Paul Defiant, the Daffy. And we've looked at the Gloucester Gladiator. The Hurricane is kind of the, I don't want to say unsung hero of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, but it certainly has been overshadowed in history by the Spitfire. But it played a very important and crucial role, and it had some features that the Spitfire did not, or at least some qualities. This essentially started off as internal designed by Hawker. It was a mono wing version of their Fury. It really dated back to 1933, but at that time the RAF, the Air Ministry, was not all that interested in mono wings. They were still hooked on biplanes. So the design was basically shelved, and really there wasn't a good engine for it anyway at that time. But by 1935, attitudes were changing, both politically and in the Air Ministry. For one, the Nazis were gaining more and more control in Germany, and more funding was allowed for the Air Ministry, the RAF. Up until that point, they'd been relying on older biplanes. They had a few Furies, but mostly it was Bulldogs, and then they had some Hearts, which was a good plane, but yeah, it was a bomber kind of pressed into the role of a fighter. They wanted a new plane that was modern construction, fast. They really actually wanted 8 machine guns, so a significant increase from what had been seen before. And Hawker submitted the design that they like to call the Hurricane, which later the RAF would approve as the name. And originally the first prototype that flew in 1935 was set up to fire 4 machine guns. It was a little too far in development, so the early ones would have 4 machine guns. Later they would fit them with 8. These would still be the standard 303 that we're used to. It was a relatively traditional plane. It was the first to use the new Merlin engine, which would become very famous later. Originally we would have a 2-bladed wood prop. Later we would go to this 3-bladed metal. These would be ordered in 1936, and the first production would fly in 1937, and these would start to enter squadron service a short time later, late that year, in fact Christmas Day of that year. So by 1938, they were starting to go into RAF service. In fact, when World War II began, unlike with the Defiant, where they didn't really have any, there were 550 Hurricanes in service. So not bad, and of course production was ramped up. In fact, in 1940 they would start making these in Canada, and several factories would contribute to their manufacturing in the UK. This used a pretty traditional construction style with the partial wooden frame. Early wings would actually be fabric covered, although they would go to a metal wing skin in 1939. Because these were made with very traditional techniques familiar to people accustomed to the older planes, it meant that squadrons and local depots could easily repair and service these. They were not difficult. They were also quite inexpensive to manufacture while still delivering good performance. The Hurricane was definitely crucial during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. A lot of times these were used as night fighters. And really you can't really talk about it without talking about the Spitfire. The Spitfire was faster, more modern, but that also meant it was more expensive and complicated. And the Hurricane, while a little slower, could still get up to about 340 miles per hour, and it actually had tighter turning, which is sometimes very good in a dogfight. Relatively large plane. We have a 40-foot wingspan, about a 32-foot fuselage. Had good handling characteristics. As I said, the first ones were equipped with 4 303 machine guns, but soon this was upgraded to 8 303, and then later variants with 4 20mm cannon would be introduced. The Mark I would primarily be produced from the beginning till about 1941, and then it would be taken over by the Mark II, which had several variations and led into the Mark III. I'm not going to break those down now. One thing to say, they did introduce in 1941 the ability to carry either drop tanks under the wings or 2 bombs. They could either be 250 pound or 500 pound bombs, which meant these started to be used in the war as ground support, ground attack, light bombers in addition to being fighters. So this became more of a fighter bomber. And these would be produced in very large numbers up through 1944. They would build just under 14,500. And this would be the first Allied plane to be sent to Soviet Russia under Lend-Lease. Russia would receive nearly 3,000 Hurricanes. The Russians grumbled about them, but then again they also grumbled about the Spitfire, so that's a whole story in and of itself, the way they received some of the Lend-Lease gear. There's a lot that can be said about this plane, so if you're interested, I encourage you to read about the Hurricane. It's a very neat design, and it was an inexpensive and easy to produce and maintain fighter when Britain really needed it in 1940 and into 1941. So much so that 55% of the aerial kills in the Battle of Britain are attributed to the Hurricane, whereas the Spitfire gained about 42%. But on the other hand, it must be pointed out that the Hurricanes mostly went after the bombers, whereas the Spitfires took on the fighter escorts themselves. So, you know, credit where credit's due and all that. A very neat plane. It actually spawned several variants, including this one over here, the Typhoon. Personally, I think this is a really neat design and a neat model. The Typhoon really got its start way back in 1937, after Hawker had basically wrapped up the development of the Hurricane. Designers there started working on kind of a larger, more powerful, more capable interceptor version. And then in 1938, the Air Ministry put out a specification for a new medium weight, high altitude interceptor that needed to go at least 400 miles per hour, and they wanted it to be fitted with up to 12 303 machine guns, so quite a hefty firepower there. What Hawker did, they started basically with the Hurricane, but they made a new wing. It's a wider wingspan, just under 42 feet. The fuselage is about the same though, at 32 feet. It has a slight sweep to it, called a gull's wing style, kind of like an F4U Corsair. It's a very thick wing. It's got a lot of store area inside for fuel, and also it has a lot of space underneath for things. It would also be fitted with two of the most powerful engines of the day, the Vulture and the Sabre. There are two versions. These would be tried in two-engine bombers like the Wellington and the Avro Manchester as well, but the Vulture gave problems, and the Sabre did too. These engines really never were fully matured, although the Sabre did a little better, I think. In February of 1940, the first prototype of what would become the Typhoon flew. But then in May, structural issues were observed. There were issues with the Sabre engine. It ended up kind of getting a low priority. Other planes like the Hurricane, the Spitfire, bombers like the Blenheim were given priority. So this was kind of put on the back burner for more testing and development throughout the summer of 1940. But then in 1941, a new German plane appeared in the skies, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, and the Typhoon was kind of rushed into service to go up against it. They would fly a second prototype in May of 1941. The first prototype would have the 12 guns, 303 machine guns as requested, but the second prototype would actually have 4 20mm cannon. That was in early May of 41, and by late May of 41, the first production Typhoons were rolling off the assembly line with assistance from Gloucester. And they were put into the field, and they ended up using them as kind of a low altitude interceptor to go up against the FW-190. And at first it wasn't good. Wasn't good at all. The plane still had issues with the engines. They didn't want to always start. They had issues with that. They also had structural issues. The bugs were not all worked out yet, almost so that this was nearly canceled. But designers kept working, and really by 1942, it had started to come into its own. They had fixed some issues, and they'd kind of figured out how to use this plane. In September of that year, they introduced wing racks for bombs. They could carry one 500 or even 1,000-pound bomb per each wing, which up to 2,000 pounds is pretty good for a fighter type plane. That was thanks to the Sabre engine and the large wing. So these started to be used as ground attack craft. In addition, they were put on patrol from 42 to 43 against F-190s that were fitted with bombs themselves that were doing kind of light bombing raids against England. These are called tip and runs. So these were designed to intercept them, and they were put on patrol to have a few in the air at all times on the southern coast. But then it was really 1943 that the Typhoon came into its own. That year, the wings were plumbed for drop tanks, giving it longer range and more versatility. Also, the wings were fitted with racks for rockets. These were 60-pound rockets, and originally it could carry 8 under each wing. And this allowed it to be a ground attacker. It could go up against armor and light installations. So they started using these around October of that year as rocket raiders, basically going after things, just harassing the Germans in Europe, being a nuisance. So they did up through D-Day. Before D-Day, they would disrupt communications, supply chains, just, kind of just be there. Then after D-Day, these would be flying along with the troops and be basically close air support, a very modern concept. There would be radio operators on the ground that would call in what we would think of as airstrikes, and they would even mark the targets with smoke shells. And then the Typhoons would fly in and dump a bunch of rockets on them. Now, the rockets were not terribly accurate. They were hard to aim, but they were effective if they hit their target. Also that year, they would go to this 4-bladed propeller, larger one here, 4 blades instead of the original 3. They would continue to try to improve the engine, and they would go to a new, larger tailplane to help correct some of the plane's issues. It was reasonably fast considering its size and abilities. It could get a little over 400 miles per hour. Had a slightly lower ceiling than the Hurricane, but still could get up to about 35,000 feet. At this point, these are pretty much all equipped with 4 20mm cannons. They would try doubling up the rockets to 16. This wasn't really done much, but there were some towards the end of the war that were fitted with a dozen rockets. These would also be employed late in 44 in so-called cloak and dagger raids, attacking German headquarters, information hubs, high command structures, even just houses that generals were in, if espionage, if spy activities would tell them where to go. This was quite a very effective tactic. Finally, in 1945, the Typhoon was used in large numbers to support Operation Varsity, which was crossing the Rhine into Nazi Germany in March. And again, they were still used as close support for the ground. They were also given targets of anti-aircraft batteries and things to take out with their bombs and rockets. They still used some as bombers, and some other squadrons would be equipped with rockets. They typically either or, they didn't do both. And then finally, at the beginning of May, really the last activity, they would use these to sink some maritime shipping of Germany, including troop transports and the like, so they were used a bit to attack naval targets. They would build over 3,300 of the Typhoon. It would also lead to other variations, such as the Tempest and the Tornado. And it was a good design. It kind of found its role, especially 43, 44, but it was never perfect. It never had all of its bugs worked out. To that end, these were taken out of production in 45 and then actually retired from service at the end of that year. So these didn't really outlive World War II. But I just think it's a neat design because it's kind of like an A-10 of World War II Britain, And I just think the model from Corgi here is neat because we have the cannons, we've got the rockets on the wings, just a lot going on, very beefy looking plane, compared with the Hurricane over here, which is pretty slim and just looks more agile and more effective as a fighter. But yeah, I just thought we had to talk about Hawker's contributions to World War II, from the Battle of Britain through the surrender of Germany. And of course, we just have one left next, so we will get to that very soon. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below, and if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you next time.